Right, so to have a somewhat bigger network, I just copy and paste here some code where you can see it's very similar to what we had before, it's a variable called my network. If I execute this code here, you can see my network has now been defined as a bigger network. And that network has how many nodes? So we have to see, we can count it. We can also use code to decide that. Let's just use code to find out how many nodes there are. And the way to do it is my network. And to specify what its size is. So size of my network, if I do this, you can see that the size of the network is 5 by 5. But I'm not interested in 5 by 5. I just want to know the number of nodes. So I'm going to specify the number of nodes is the size of network. But please just give me the first number out of 2. And if I execute that code at the bottom, you can see the number of nodes is now correctly stored as being 5. And you remember how to find out the number of edges. You can use the previous code, find where my network is equal to 1. Then you can count the number of edges as well. We're going to do something slightly more advanced now, as we're going to create a biograph object of it. So in order to display a network as a network's graph, we need to create a biograph object in MATLAB. So let's do that. Let's access the bioinformatics toolbox of MATLAB, which I think you all have installed, and use it in order to display the network graphically. So the way to do is the biograph object, we can just abbreviate it BG, short for biograph, and it's biograph of that network's matrix that I have specified. So you can see here, if I do nothing, MATLAB tries to help you by telling you that following the open of the round parentheses, you need to specify the C matrix, which you could interpret as connectivity matrix, or in our terminology in the course, network matrix. So network matrix, where is it? My network is not yet defined, so I will just give that name, my network. And if I execute that code, you can see that following the number of nodes at the bottom, it says biograph object with 5 nodes and 9 edges. Oh, actually, now we know how many edges there are because MATLAB does the counting internally. So that was successful. So we have created an object, but still not what we wanted. We wanted to see that, right? And if we wanted to see the network, what we can specify, say, call it biograph view. That is the view, the visualized object. And we do that using a function called view and apply it to biograph, that object that we just created. So the object created biograph will still remain there. And we just make sure we want to see it using view. You see view here. So when I execute that code, MATLAB will bring up the view, which is a biograph viewer window or a display of the plot. So yes, so here's a bit of a problem. It's nice that some view is there, but of course you can see by default that font of that names within the nodes is fairly small. So we need to change that. So what we're going to do, I'm going to clear my window here and going into my code, I'm going to show you how to specify if you want to change a feature in that object. So remember, this is our graph. and we think that font of the node names, which is actually, if you could read it, it would be saying node 1, node 2, and so on until node 5, because it's 5 nodes. But because it's too small, we need to change it, and we need to access this object, the Biograph view object, in order to change some property of it. So the thing to do is to use set, and that in round parentheses, you apply it to BG view, the object that we have just created, and you specify that from that object you want to have access to the nodes. Comma. Next thing, now you need to specify what do you want. Well, in this case, and you put that in single quotes, we want to change the font size. So you can see it highlights in magenta. Font size meaning how big are the letters of the name that is given to a given node. And by comma separated, then you have to specify what size should that font have. And I have no idea. We'll just try something. Say 30, that's PT from the font view. And we'll just try it, see what happens if we put that into execution. So the code actually displayed the same network as before, but node names are now nice, legible, clear to define. In our materials, it also tells you how to specify nodes in a customary form. So you can give, of course, every node the name that you like to have. Right. Maybe just as another thing, if I show you a second way. If you want to access a single node, right now we have changed the font of every node. So if you wanted to access a single node, say you think that the node number 3 is somehow different. So you can access that node property by saying bg subview dot nodes. So you access nodes, but then you specify 3, say node number 3. And then you want to change, for example, its color. So you specify color as an argument instead of font size, and you say you want to have that color something different than what it was. So I'll show you later what that exactly means, but the way to do is to put in 3 numbers between 0 and 1, specifying the amount of red, green, and blue. For short, RGB. That's the RGB code. You put that in square brackets, and we might set it to RGB, so red 0, no red, green 1, and blue 0, so that should be a green node. So if we do that, we come up with the same graph as before, same font size, because we have adjusted the font size, and that node number 3 that we picked is in green, so given a different number. Please check the MATLAB options to have all the features that you can access in this way. I'm going to show you if you wanted to change an edge property, how would you do that? So as you can imagine, it would be something very similar. Those things are analogous in code. So we would have to change the BG view, that's our network that we have. And if we just start with E, then you can see there's a property, a method called edges. If you want to change something of the edges, then you use edges. And one of the things that we have in edges is the line color. So if you wanted to change the color of an edge, then the same, you specify that you want to have the color of that edge, which is line color. This is the argument. And the values that we do very similar to before, we specify a color and say we want it in blue, then R is 0, green is 0, and blue is 1. And executing the code, you can see that all edges are now in blue, including the arrowheads. Right. So we know how to set up the network matrix. We know how to create a Biograph object. You know how to visualize the object, and you've seen some tricks of accessing the two main properties of that object, which are nodes and edges, and how to modify them according to some code and according to some keywords that we can learn. There's actually something that's very interesting, especially if you are more on the beginning side, at the more point where you start to experiment with MATLAB. And I want to show you that for our final part of today's webinar, and that is this whole Biograph object in the view, in the Biograph viewer, is interactive. So interactive means you can interact with it directly. And if you can see that on my screen, let me interact with it. So I say that node number 1, you see I'm hovering my mouse cursor and I'm clicking on node number 1. I'm not sure if that's good enough to resolve, but if you look closely, that node number 1 after clicking has a red frame. A red frame means it's highlighted or selected. And once a node is selected, you can actually take the cursor and pull it around, say, pull it to over here. And you see how it changed position, and the arrow sort of in more or less random way followed somehow. It means you can choose the position by hand. You can also do it by code, but it's more tedious. By hand, you can specify where exactly that node is going to be located. So I don't know what is a good position for node number 1. Let's just leave it here. And then you remember we changed the font size and we changed the background color. So how do we get all those things from the graph? It's a nice trick. If you see my cursor is above that node, which is highlighted, and I do a right click. You have to know how to do a right click, but once you know how to do a right click, a menu opens that shows you node properties. So click, select node properties. And although this is now a bit small, hopefully we can use that. I'll just position it slightly a different place. And that's how you get all the possibilities in order to modify for a certain node, font size, color, background, shape, everything. Right, we'll just do an example here. So what do we start with? Font size we have done already. Line color, let's try line color is another color. If you can see, it's blue currently. And we change that to, say, magenta. If I select that node, you can see that's this little box that surrounds the node. And if I go to other node properties, say the shape of the node, you can see clicking on box, which is the default, you can see a menu of different shapes that are available. So if you think that node is too edgy or too rectangular, want to change it into an ellipse, you can do that. And so on, right? So you can change, access all those properties there. Okay, take that away. Now that the edges look fairly ugly, if your mouse cursor is above the white surface of that Biograph window, by right-clicking on it, you can see some possibilities to modify this. So you can refresh the layout, but you can also refresh the edges. If you refresh the edges only, it means that the nodes will remain in the same position relative to each other, but Biograph will try to rescale it such that it's nicely centered. You can see that made things much bigger and trying to put the edges a little bit more nicely. If you still don't like it, you might still try to click on it and move it a little bit and say that's what we would like to have. Right, so now we have seen node properties, background refreshing. We can also try to go on the white area and refresh the layout now. What you can see is just by refreshing layout, another right click, it's the second option here. We get back to the original way, the default display of Biograph. And something that I've not yet mentioned, so let's conclude with this. Can we access the edges? Of course, we can access the edges as well, right? You would have guessed already, but need to have a little care. If your mouse cursor hovers over the edge, right-clicking on it, you get to edge properties. So I have to be careful to actually hit that very thin arrow, but getting to edge properties, you can do something about it. And for example, there's the there's the option to change the line width. And if you change the line width to say 4, did it not change it? Yeah, just with a little bit of delay, it makes the arrow bigger. So if you combine what you have seen now with the previous way of set, the code that we've seen before, please try as an exercise, try to find out how to change the size or the thickness of all of the edges at the same time. So remember set biograph object dot edges, and then you can use the keyword argument will be line width. It's here highlighted in that menu table if you forgot it. It's also in the documentation, but here's a quick way of seeing it. And you just specify the number in PTs that you would like to have. So you want it even thicker. You can set it to 8 and so on. And you can give it the thickness that you want. So while we are now doing it to sort of play around and understand how MATLAB works with it, of course, in network biology, what we want to do is we can, for example, access this feature, the line width, and we can use it to display how important we think an edge is, right? You can see now all of these arrows are very thin and hard to see. But if I just take that window away, but that one edge that I highlighted is now very visible, very obvious. So you can use that to graphically display the information of which edge is more important than others. And if you have some numbers to it, so like the weight of a connection, if that's specified in terms of numbers, of course, that number can be used to make that edge thicker or thinner, respectively. Okay, these were the features that you needed to do the assignment of network session number 1 in our course. So hopefully that has helped you a little bit. Finally, I think maybe you want to save a figure in order to keep a document of it. So I'll show you how to save a figure under File in that Biograph viewer. There's the menu for File. You can say Print to Figure. If you do Print of Figure, a new window opens. Right? Don't be surprised. It's a copy of the previous one, but it's now called Figure 1 in MATLAB. And it's a plot figure, just as all the figures that you do when you do plot, like in the session 1 introduction to MATLAB, where you have plotted Fibonacci numbers. So this is now of the same type, unlike the Biograph view, which is different. Here's now a window of the same type. And in File, you have the option to do Save As, like any Word document, you can do Save As, and we'll just do that together to terminate. And it then asks you to store it by default in the folder where you are currently. So this is my network figure, so to make it obvious, and there's a menu to choose what format you want to have. If you think you're going to do MATLAB on it further, you take it, you can save it as a MATLAB figure. So it has a .m. But if you want to have it as a JPEG or PDF or SVG for display in the internet, or just use something that saves memory, which is PNG. I just cannot see it right now as PNG. Oh, here at the top, PNG. And then I say save it. And if I just click away all those previous figures, And then it's on my desktop as PNG, and this is now the saved figure, which you can import into a doc Word file or whatever you like to do with it.